Hello friends, and welcome to AnthroView. I'm Jamison Mokel, tabletop gamer and fan of all things anthropological. This video is the first part of our special series on tabletop game design, where I am going to show you some useful methods for improving your game design process by using social science research methods and theory. Before we get into that though, I thought it would be a good idea to lay out some important concepts, define some terms, and tell you why tabletop games are great to study from an anthropological perspective. So let's get to it. Even though I've studied anthropology and played games for years, until I started looking at game design, I hadn't really put the two together in my head in any significant way. Now I can't help but see the connections whenever I think about games. For starters, tabletop games are filled with human interaction and fascinating behaviors. If you play tabletop games, you've certainly experienced many kinds of players. Aggressive ones, passive ones, people who spend too long strategizing, and ones that do things seemingly at random. How people act during play might offer some insights into their values, beliefs, and lifestyle outside of gaming. And while those things aren't necessarily the focus of this study, they are going to come up when we talk about observing player behaviors as a way to design better games, so stay tuned for that. For now, suffice it to say that a play session of a board game can be a rich source of anthropological data. The other thing that makes games anthropological is that they need humans, anthros if you will, to make them, well, games. Now, I don't just mean that humans have to design games, though there is that, but more that, without people to play them, games are just pieces in a box. When we open that box, however, and start rolling dice, reading cards, and moving pieces, that's when the components and systems become a game. Moreover, the vast majority of games are heavily based around interactions between players. Even when you're playing a cooperative game with challenges controlled by the game's system, you are still, to some extent, playing against another player, in this case, the designer of the game. Humans influence every aspect of gameplay, in design, in play, and in the discussions around games. Tabletop games are especially interesting because they don't even have a way to do anything without humans manipulating them. In a video game, if you don't push any buttons, things can still affect your character in the game. In a tabletop game, someone has to control every moving part, and the computations all take place in the players' heads. It's no wonder that scholars and researchers of human behavior have taken an interest in games for years. Tabletop games are full of things we can examine under a social science lens. They revolve around social interactions and influence our behaviors in certain ways. And I'm far from the first person to make this connection. The field of game studies is often called Ludology. One of the earliest examples of a sociological examination of games, more broadly of play, is Johann Huizinga's 1938 book Homo Ludens, an oft-cited text that explores the role of play in human culture. Huizinga identified the magic circle of play, the space where all the players of a game are temporarily transformed into something other than themselves for the duration of the game. Brave warriors in Dungeons and Dragons, ruthless capitalists in Monopoly, and so on. Anthropologically speaking, this is the ritual of games, the way players take on new roles while they play. In Homo Ludens, Huizinga basically argues that play is foundational to human life, and we can include games in this. You see, as infants, we start playing before we can even comprehend other parts of culture, such as language or acceptable behavior. Even animals play without any human influence. Play is something that we do naturally, according to Huizinga, and that makes it worth studying seriously. More recent game studies have explored things like the role games play in education and rehabilitation, how they teach us to persevere in spite of failure and adversity, how they make us better artists and critical thinkers, and even how games can subvert expectations and challenge social norms. Do I think that games are awesome just because they can be fun? Absolutely. But I also think games are great sources of information, platforms for teaching, and rich veins of social and cultural knowledge. And I don't just mean tangential learning, the process of learning about things that appear in games, though I did learn a lot of my vocabulary from playing role-playing games as a kid. No, what I mean is that games tell us something about ourselves and our cultures through play. We can explore our values and our interests in our game selection. And tabletop games in particular are fascinating petri dishes of human behavior. How we sit around a table, how we interact with players and components, and how we celebrate victories and lament defeats are culturally coded. All this is a long way of saying games are as much a source of anthropological data as our weddings, funerals, and your local bar. And that means that game designers are valuable brokers of cultural knowledge. They influence audiences and our behavior in interesting ways by giving us a space to play and to interact, and as such, they are well suited to benefit from the practices and methods of social science research. That's what this series is all about. I'm going to do my best to teach game designers how they can tap into anthropological techniques to make richer, more purposeful games that will capture players' imaginations and possibly even convey some deeper meanings. And hopefully they will be fun as well, since at the end of the day, if a game isn't fun, most people won't want to play it anyway. Before I get into the real body of my research, however, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page with some of the things I'll be talking about in this series, especially game and design terminology. The anthropological stuff I'll be talking about will be covered in detail in the following videos. So let's get started by defining some game terms and concepts. The word game might seem straightforward, but in reality, a great deal of space has been dedicated to defining just what games are. Salen and Zimmerman collected 8 different definitions of game and play from scholars in a range of fields to try and create a cohesive definition. Then they wrote a definition based on those other definitions, and even their combined description can be argued with. That being said, I'm going to use their definition for this project because it does a good enough job for our purposes here. Salins and Zimmerman define games as systems in which players engage in an artificial conflict defined by rules that results in a quantifiable outcome. So you've got players playing the game, you have the artifice of the situation, rules that govern what you can and can't do in the game, and an unambiguous conclusion. Now some of you are surely thinking of examples that defy this definition, and that's great, because even Salin and Zimmerman knew that their definition was not beyond reproach. But this definition gives us a solid starting point to understand what games are, and like any good art or science, the devil is in the details. Good designers know how to bend and break these rules, and when to leave well enough alone and stick with what works. So this definition will guide us, but my research specifically relates to a subdivision of games, although it's a fairly broad one, and that is tabletop games. Tabletop games can refer to board games like Risk or Pandemic, to card games like Uno or Dominion, to role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons or Fiasco, and to a range of other games that are often played around a table or a similar surface. The general qualities that I'll note for the types of games we'll be discussing here are that they are typically played in person, using some kind of physical components, and follow printed rules. So we aren't talking about digital games like video games, or sports games played on actual fields. If you want to see examples of what I'm calling tabletop games, the website Board Game Geek is a great resource. The range of games you can find there will give you a sense of the types of games the people I worked with design. Speaking of design, designers are people who make things. But since I'm going to use the word designer a lot in this series, I'm just going to point out here that I'm talking about tabletop game designers unless I specifically make exceptions such as graphic designers or industrial designers. I'm primarily concerned with the people who make the games I defined a minute ago. In my research, I worked with designers in the San Francisco Bay Area whose experience and involvement in the tabletop game industry spans a fairly wide range. Some are amateur designers just getting started, some are published designers working full-time in the industry, and many were somewhere in between. Regardless of their experience and involvement, these folks were my primary sources of information, my informants for this project, though I'm also building off of a wide range of literature on design and game studies, and my own anthropological training, of course. Now, for the stuff that games are made of. Physically, tabletop games are made up of components, which can take many forms. Boards, cards, dice, tokens, and miniatures are some of the most common ones that most people are familiar with. Tabletop games can include a few components, say some dice, scorecards, and pencils in Yahtzee, or hundreds, like in Gloomhaven, which includes multiple decks of cards, map tiles, tons of tokens, and elaborate miniatures, as well as boxes inside the game box with new content that gets added as you play. Basically, the components of games are the material culture you need to play them. Besides the physical components, you also need the knowledge of how the game works, and that is referred to broadly as the rules. The rules typically come on a sheet or in a booklet, and they can run the gamut of brief, basic pamphlets in quicker, smaller games like Hex, to literally thousands of pages of ever-expanding content in some of the larger role-playing game systems like Pathfinder or Dungeons & Dragons. Meanwhile, a system is how all the rules, components, and players interact and influence each other. Our friends Salin and Zimmerman think of systems as contexts for interaction, which can be spaces, objects, and behaviors that players explore, manipulate, and inhabit. It's all the stuff that turns the individual pieces and bits of knowledge into a game. The system is the complex whole that brings all the other stuff together and makes the game something bigger than the constituent parts. Think of Monopoly, even if it's painful to do so. On the one hand, you have a board and dice and a little silver piece that represents you and a pile of worthless paper money, and on the other hand, you have the rules that tell you how to move and when you can spend your paper money and when random chances determine who wins and who flips the table. The connective tissue of those things is the game system. I roll dice, I calculate the total, then I pick up my little silver race car and move it that number of spaces clockwise around the board. If I land on an unowned property, I can either buy it for a set price, meaning I take my paper money and give it to the bank, then receive a deed to show my ownership, or I send it to auction. If I land on an owned property, I have to pay rent to the owner, and before long, I don't want to play anymore. That is the system of Monopoly. Well, not wanting to play anymore is a symptom of Monopoly, but that's neither here nor there. In tabletop gaming and design, mechanics are one of the core subjects that gets discussed most frequently. Mechanics can be viewed as a part of the game's system, but they're also touchstones that reach between one game and another. While I hate to use Monopoly for more examples, most of us are familiar with the game. And if you are, then you're already familiar with some game mechanics, such as the roll and move mechanic. You grab some dice, roll them, get the total, and move that many spaces across the board. This mechanic has been used by tons of other games though, such as Clue, Talisman, and Zombies, to name a few. Mechanics are kind of like genres in film. They tell you something about the experience you're going to get based on your knowledge of other examples in the medium. In this series, you're going to hear me talk a lot about these last two terms, and they are closely related, so I'm combining them here. These are prototypes and playtesting. A prototype is any game in its design stage. Every game starts with a prototype, a basic model of mechanics, components, and rules that will eventually become the game system. You can start a prototype from a number of angles too. Some designers start by designing a core mechanic. Some are inspired by a type of player interaction they want to encourage, and some begin with a theme they want to explore, like fantasy or sci-fi. Because of how the design process works, prototypes can come in any form, from a pile of handwritten cards to a sophisticated package that resembles a published game. Basically, prototypes are games with kinks to work out, and they can change a lot from one stage to the next through the process of iteration. Iteration is the process of designing something, testing it, and then making changes based on those tests. The best iterations come from playtesting, which is when you take your prototype to get feedback from other people about how the game could be better. A playtest is any session of play intended to learn how the game can improve. Early playtests might not even get through one whole game, or might include tons of tweaks and adjustment done on the fly. Later stages of playtesting, hopefully, are just to iron out some wrinkles, check that the text on the cards is as clear as possible, and that the rules are functioning as intended, and of course that the game is fun. We're going to spend a lot of time covering these concepts more in depth and getting into how they all work together, but this should at least get us all on the same page in regards to the big ideas I'll be covering. Next time, I'll start looking at our first anthropological technique that should help you design some fun games, participant observation. Until then, may knowledge guide you.